Hey guys, welcome back to Fantasy Tipped. My name is Julian, and in today's episode, we're doing something a little bit different. What we're doing in today's episode is we're going to take a look at the schedule throughout February because there are a few changes that were made to the fantasy schedule because of the Olympic break being canceled. And then we're going to take a look at the playoff schedule for your fantasy playoffs, and we're going to take a look at what teams are the best teams to own for those playoffs. Some teams have a much more favorable fantasy playoff schedule than other teams, so it may be worth it to go out and trade players from teams that don't play a lot during the fantasy playoffs for teams that, maybe play a little bit more. So it's something that could help you down the stretch, and will basically let you know if you have a good team, a team that's set for those fantasy playoffs, if you have a lot of players that are playing a lot of games. Before we get started though, guys, please leave a like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and follow me on Twitter at Fantasy Tipped. I'm constantly posting there to help you guys, optimize your schedule and help you in each and every week of the fantasy season. So be sure to do that. Now, let's jump right into the content and let's talk about the February schedule. Now, we're currently on week 15 of the fantasy hockey season, which means next week is the start of February and the start of week 16. Now, week 16 was originally supposed to run from January 31st all the way to February 27th. Yeah, it was going to be almost a month-long week, which is crazy, but it was supposed to include the All-Star break and the Olympic break. The thing is, there is no Olympic break anymore, so there are a whole bunch of games that got rescheduled that are now scheduled for that time. Because of this one super long, month-long week got split into 3 weeks. Week 16, which is next week, is going to run from January 31st to February 13th. So instead of being a whole month, it's going to be 2 weeks. And it's not 2 whole weeks because there's the All-Star break in there. So it's only 10 days of games. So it's only a little bit longer than your average week. Then week 17 is a standard week, which runs from February 14th to February 20th. And as usual, there's 7 days of games. Week 18, same thing, from February 21st to February 27th. With 7 days of games as well. But because there weren't really many games scheduled during that time beforehand, some teams have much more optimal schedules than others. These teams are mostly the teams that got kind of screwed with their schedules earlier in the season, like the Ottawa Senators. And as you can see here in week 16, in those 10 days, the Ottawa Senators play 6 games, which is a lot. So if you can go ahead and grab yourself an Ottawa Senators player to stream for that week, that's a pretty solid idea. The Coyotes, the Flames, the Oilers, the Devils, the Leafs, the Canucks, and the Washington Capitals all also play 5 games for a pretty optimal schedule. Now, there are 3 teams that have a really awful schedule through week 16, and those teams are LA, New York, and San Jose. They only play 1 game throughout the entire 10-day slate, which is absolutely terrible, so it's not going to help you at all for next week. And if you're holding on to some lower-owned LA Kings player and you desperately need a win, well, it might be prudent to drop those guys from LA, New York, and San Jose. For example, Alex Iafallo, if you're in a 12-man league, he's probably droppable for, that 2-week slate because, man, he's really just not going to help you. And if you're really desperate for that win, it's probably something you're going to have to do. Now, the Ducks, the Panthers, the Flyers, and the Blues don't have it much better with only 2 games in those 10 days. Obviously, if you're holding on to some really good players from the Panthers, the Blues, the Ducks, you're not going to drop them. But it's going to be a rough week for you if you have a lot of players from those teams on your roster. So now let's take a look at February as a whole. It's now 3 weeks. It used to be 1, but it's now 3 whole weeks. So let's see who has the most optimal schedule. Well, that goes to the Edmonton Oilers. They play 5 games in week 16, and then they play 5 games in week 17, which is a normal 7-day slate. So they play Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday, which is absolutely incredible. So if you own McDavid that week, you're pretty much guaranteed to win, which is awesome. And then in week 18, they play a standard 3 games. Ottawa is the next best team to own. They play 6, 4, and then 2. So, the third week isn't the best. You could probably drop your lower owned Senators that week. But for the first couple weeks, definitely great to own some Sens. The Leafs are another great team to own with 5, 3, and 4. Then the Winnipeg Jets is a really good team to own with 4 games in all 3 weeks, which is pretty great. Then the Columbus Blue Jackets with 4, 3, 4. The Calgary Flames with 5, 3, 3. the New York Islanders with 4-3-4, etc. Another team to note is the Chicago Blackhawks, who play 4 games in Week 16 and in Week 17, which is pretty good. Any low-owned Blackhawks you add for those weeks, you can end up dropping for Week 18 since they do only play 2 games. But those are the teams that I would be targeting for the month of February as a whole. So guys like Blake Coleman, who are kind of borderline roster players right now, they're kind of guys that I would consider adding right now because, well, Blake Coleman is going to be playing a lot of games this month. Same thing with guys like Tim Stützle or Alex Formenton of the Ottawa Senators. They're guys that I'm definitely considering adding right now because of their schedule. Now, going to the flip side of this, there's one team that has just the most horrendous schedule in February, and that team is the Tampa Bay Lightning. Now, that first week with that 10-game slate, it's not too bad. They played 3 games, which is not awful. But then the week after that, they only have 1 game scheduled in Week 17, which is really bad. And then the week after that, it doesn't get better. They only have 2 games scheduled. So if you're hoping on to some low-owned Tampa Bay players, it's probably worth dropping them and grabbing someone who's going to get some more games for you. Like, for example, a Ryan McDonagh, definitely not worth holding. And Eric Chernak, definitely not worth holding. Cirelli and Killorn, it depends on your league size. If you're in a pretty deep league, unfortunately, you're going to have to hold them because they will get picked up if you drop them. But if you're in a shallower league, let's say 10-man, you can probably drop Cirelli and maybe even Killorn. There are 5 other teams with pretty brutal schedules in February, and those teams are Detroit, LA, Nashville, the Rangers, and the Philadelphia Flyers, and they only play 7 games the entire month, which is not great, but at least for LA and New York, their schedule becomes pretty decent after that initial Week 16. That's not great for them, but after that, their schedule kind of is half decent. But as for Philadelphia, they play 2 games in both Week 16 and 17, so if you're owning any low-rostered Philadelphia Flyers, you can probably swap them for those weeks. For the Red Wings, the same thing. For Week 16, they're okay, but after that, not great. And for the Nashville Predators as well, guys like Jeannot, Ryan Johansson, unfortunately aren't going to be as valuable anymore just because of the lack of games. So if you have a guy like that, maybe you can try trading him for someone who plays a little bit more often and see what you can get. Now, don't worry, guys. I will be posting these tables on both YouTube and on my Twitter, so you guys can definitely use that to consult for future weeks. Now let's jump into the fun part and let's take a look at what the fantasy playoffs are going to look like for you. And for the most people in most leagues, fantasy playoffs start on March 28th in Week 23, and they go until the end of Week 25, which ends April 11th. If your fantasy playoffs go till the end of Week 26, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. I still made a chart for you guys. Now, the number 1 and 2 teams to own for these fantasy playoffs, believe it or not, are the Buffalo Sabres and St. Louis Blues. Those 2 teams play 4 games in each of the fantasy playoff weeks. So guys like David Perron and Braden Shen are very appealing to own for the fantasy playoff for sure. Then the Carolina Hurricanes, the Dallas Stars, the Minnesota Wild, the New York Islanders, the Toronto Maple Leafs are also teams that have pretty freaking good playoff schedules as well. So these are the teams you want to really be targeting on your team for those fantasy playoffs. Owning both Sorokin and Varlamov for those fantasy playoffs, yeah, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape if you got those guys. One thing to note, guys, is I'm not going to talk about off nights just yet for the playoffs because your lineup is going to change a lot from now until the playoffs. You're going to have a lot of guys that are going to come in and out of your lineup. The only guys that are really going to be sticking in your lineup is your core guys. And this is what you can see with this chart here and see how many of your core guys have a lot of games during those playoffs. Now, the teams with the worst schedules in the fantasy playoffs are Washington, Vegas, and Vancouver. If you own players from these teams, I'm not freaking out. Their schedules are not that bad. They play 3 games in all but one of the weeks, and in that week they play 2 games. If you own a guy like Pacioretty, Jack Eichel, Mark Stone, Jonathan Marchessault, Ovechkin, like, I'm not freaking out, right? They're still going to produce just fine in the playoffs. They just don't have as many games, but you'll still probably do just fine with those guys in your lineup. If you do want to try flipping them for someone who plays more, you can do that too, but I'm not freaking out too much since their schedule is not that bad. Same goes with players from Chicago, Colorado, and New Jersey. They only play 9 games through 3 weeks, but that's not too bad. And you should be able to deal with that, especially if you own a guy like McKinnon, Rantanen, and Landeskog. Don't freak out too much. 3 games per week is more than enough for those guys. All right, so what if you were in a bit of a weird league and your playoffs end on April 18th at the end of week 26 instead of the end of week 25? Well, that would mean that your playoffs start on week 24. And therefore, the best teams to own for that stretch is St. Louis and Toronto. Those two teams play 4 games in each of those weeks and therefore are very valuable teams to own. So if you own Austin Matthews and your playoffs end week 26, you're going to be looking pretty good probably. You have a very good chance of making it far, right? By default, you're getting a lot of games from your stud, which is great. Other teams with pretty good schedules are Nashville, Boston, Carolina, Calgary, Dallas, Detroit, Minnesota, Montreal, the Islanders, Ottawa Senators, the San Jose Sharks, and the Tampa Bay Lightning. They all play 11 games, so 2 weeks of 4 games and 1 week of 3 games, which is pretty freaking good as well. Players from those teams are definitely good to have on your fantasy team. And then if your league ends in week 26, Washington and Vancouver get a little bit of a boost because their final week is much better with 4 games apiece. And Vegas still does have the worst schedule out of any team with 2 games, then 3 games, then 3 games. But if you have the Vegas studs, don't worry too much. In the semifinals and the finals, you'll have Pacioretty, you'll have Eichel, whoever you do have for 3 games, which is more than enough. So what did you think of this video, guys? I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully I was able to give you a little insight as to what the future holds for you and your fantasy team. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions, what I can do to improve videos like this in the future. And please leave a like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next episode of Fantasy Tipped.